Welcome to the Israel Bible Podcast. My name is Cindy Parker. I am an author, a speaker, and the professor of Holy Land Studies at the Israel Bible Center. I'm passionate about reading the Bible in the physical, historical, and cultural context of its day. In this podcast, I'd like to invite you to join me as I sit down each week with other faculty members of IBC to discover new aspects of the Bible. These are some of my all-time favorite dialogues because as a modern audience reading an ancient text, we know that the Bible does not need to be rewritten, but it needs to be reread. One of our associate faculty members is Dr. Taylor Gray. Along with teaching at IBC, Dr. Gray teaches Biblical Hebrew and Aramaic at the Israel Institute of Biblical Studies, and he is the assistant research professor of Classics and Ancient Mediterranean Studies at Penn State. We are talking about his new course at IBC that was recently released called Divine Imagery in the Biblical World. Last week, we were introduced to what iconography is and how much we have learned from it, especially since the 1970s. And in that conversation, Dr. Gray mentioned the book of Amos and the Psalms, but we didn't dive into it. And of course, anytime we talk about images, iconography, and pictures, while also talking about the Bible, we have to address the biblical command that says not to create an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. So I asked Dr. Gray to explain how iconography actually helps us figure out what Israelites were conceptualizing when they were thinking about or describing or writing about God. Lean in and enjoy the conversation.
It's a great question. It's one I think about pretty regularly. One of the things that I think is so ironic about this sort of the image ban that we get in the Bible, you shall not construct a graven image. We all know the commandment. What's really fascinating is that we have anthropomorphic descriptions of the deity all over the place. Like we have the texts telling us what he looks like. Ezekiel, again, is a great example, or Isaiah. The Psalms tell us that Yahweh has wings, which is a very common way of depicting deities in especially Mesopotamia. But what's curious about the image ban is what is motivating it. Why do they sort of move in that direction? And lots of people have written about this. One possibility, one that I think is perhaps the most persuasive, is in the 6th century when the Babylonians come to Jerusalem and destroy the temple. We can't prove this. There's no evidence of this archaeologically, but it seems likely that there was a statue or multiple statues that were constructed to depict Yahweh. This is what everyone did in the ancient world. And so when the Babylonians came, they stole the statue of Yahweh, which is what they did to every conquered people. They would take the statue of the deity back to Babylon, and they would sort of symbolically chain up the deity in front of Marduk. And this was a way of displaying Marduk's divine supremacy. And so the biblical writers come along and they say, well, this is a problem because we can't have God enslaved to Marduk. We can't have him harmed by anything for that matter. I mean, we know that in the ancient world, if you desecrated a statue of a god, this was a great offense, and perhaps even it harmed the deity himself or herself. And so they don't want that. And so this is a way of getting around the problem. We're just going to eliminate images of the divine.
That is also like assuming, and maybe also listeners to the podcast might be, there's something about the study of how the biblical texts were gathered together and then edited. And so that is kind of assuming that maybe that wasn't something written down initially pre-Babylon, but in Babylon, as they're gathering and editing their scriptures, then they're adding in those bans.
Yes, I think that's an entirely possible scenario, because we do see examples, at least implications, that there were images devoted to Yahweh in the Iron Age before the Neo-Babylonian period. The Ark of the Covenant is a very interesting example. The beginning of Samuel 1 Samuel 5 through 7 has this the whole ark narrative, this little vignette about the ark goes on an adventure around Israel and does all sorts of mischievous things. And what's interesting is it behaves exactly like an image would in other ancient cultures. There's no difference. And the Philistines even say when they encounter it, a god has entered into the camp. I mean, they recognize the power of this thing. And so it's no surprise maybe that the ark sort of falls out of the narrative once the temple is constructed. We don't have any more stories of the ark going around. It just sort of disappears once David brings it. And so the ark is an example. In some of the Psalms, we have these descriptions of the psalmists desiring to stand in the presence of the Lord and gaze upon his face. I mean, we could interpret this metaphorically, absolutely. But when we look at the broader context of ritual texts from the ancient Near East, this is how they talk about wanting to see the deity, the statue. And so the psalmists are sort of saying something maybe similar. And other psalms talk about, describe Yahweh entering into the temple and in this sort of celebratory sort of fashion. And we know that in the case of like Mesopotamia, the Akitu festival in Babylon, we had this whole procession with the statue of Marduk, and they talk about the statue in a very similar way, in this sort of processional sort of way. And so there are implications, though not explicit, that there might have been a statue at one time. But for the most part, it looks like most of the biblical texts are a little uncomfortable with it. Maybe the only other case is a standing stone. And I mean, the case of Jacob in Genesis 28 is a great example of this. But I mean, Hosea and Micah decry Judah and Israel for having images of the deity. So they were there. It's just whether or not they were officially allowed, I guess, is probably the way to put it.
It is interesting because when we go to ancient sites, there's an ancient site in the northern part of Israel called Dan, and outside of the Israelite gate of Dan, there's an altar with several of these standing stones. And so this kind of begs this question, because there are other places in the text where it seems like when we think of Joshua and the Israelites crossing the Jordan River, there's actually a command to pick up stones and pile stones. May they serve as a memorial to this great event. And that happens often where the stone is just something odd, something different on the horizon line to provoke your memory. What is so different about a standing stone? A standing stone in terms of like the standing stones, the multiple stones that are right next to an altar that are at Dan. How are they representing the divine in a different way? Like, how are they sacred objects?
That's a interesting question. I think the trickiest thing about standing stones is they don't have inscriptions and they don't have depictions. They're just rocks. So it's like we look at them and they're like, well, this could mean anything. So it's tricky. And a lot of people have tried to classify the way in which they're configured and where they're located. You know, are they in a temple niche? In the case of like Arad, for example, we have these ritually buried Iron Age matzevot there are two of them, and there are altars, and they're in the niche of the temple. We're probably talking about deities here. But in the case of standing stones, let's say outside a city gate, maybe we're talking about stones that are dedicated to, say, an event, like in the case of Joshua, the crossing of the Jordan, or in the case of the Sinai event representing the 12 tribes of Israel or whatever. So there are cases where these things serve as an aid, a witness. But in other cases, it's very clear that they're meant to depict a divine presence, and the whole notion of a Beit El comes up in Genesis 28. So, I mean, it's clear that these things are what we say in the business, polysemous. They have multiple meanings, and it really depends on where they are and sort of how many of them are around. But sometimes we don't know. But I mean, it's not entirely clear why the standing stone is so prevalent. I mean, it's prevalent across human culture or human civilization around the globe. But it seems kind of clear from archaeological controlled excavations anyway, that these standing stones are often used in rural contexts. We even have cases in Mari from the old Babylonian period where we know that there are these like semi-nomadic tribes that use these instead of cultic statuary because they don't have the means to construct a statue, so they use a stone instead. And so it looks like this is maybe partly where the tradition comes from. But I mean, yeah, it's a convenient object, and there's something about the stone that sort of invokes concepts of the divine, this like enduring, eternal, non-organic sort of object really serves as a visual metaphor, a physical metaphor even, and maybe not even a metaphor, an actual sort of representation of what God is.
And our depictions are not just of gods and goddesses, but through ancient Near Eastern iconography, we can maybe get a good picture of what the biblical writers were thinking of when they say that they see cherubim and they see seraphim. Can you go through what those two types of creatures are as not Renaissance paintings?
Yeah, sure. So the case of the cherubim is really interesting because other traditions, like in Mesopotamia or Egypt, we have technical terms or technical names, proper names for all sorts of protective spirits. The Bible does not have this diverse vocabulary in the same way. We have a couple of titles associated with lesser divine beings: the Malachim, the messengers, the Hasatan, whatever he is, the accuser, or whatever it is, and then the cherubim and the seraphim, and maybe Ezekiel's chayot, but those get associated with the cherubim. So, I mean, the point is that we don't have as much of a diversity. So when it comes to interpreting them, it gets a little bit trickier. We have depictions of them that make them sound far more anthropomorphic. And we have examples of these lesser divine beings that are anthropomorphic in iconography. There's a very famous example from Tel Halaf in Turkey, where we have these sort of winged human-like beings that are serving the gods. And the Apkallu are another example in Mesopotamia. So those could be what they are. They could be humans with wings. Not far from later depictions, but not as cute, far more terrifying. But then in other cases, it seems like the cherubim are far more composite. And Ezekiel's chayot are a good example of this. At the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, we get these descriptions of these very composite creatures that many four faces, lots of wings, and crazy looking bodies. And these sound a lot like the Lamassu in Mesopotamia, these protective genii, or these protective creatures that sort of guard palaces. And if you've ever been to the British Museum or the Louvre, or honestly, if you've ever seen the cover of any book about the ancient Near East, you've probably seen a picture of these things.
That's right. They are the famous ones to use because they're like super striking. And it reminds you of like Harry Potter-ish type things.
Yes, they're very chimera-like. I mean, they often have the body of a bull, the head of a human, and the wings of a griffin or the wings of a eagle or whatever. And there's sort of these sphinx-like creatures. And so this is oftentimes the direction most scholars go when they talk about the cherubim. They say, in the Bible, this is probably what we're talking about. We're talking about these sort of sphinx-like creatures. Maybe a couple of exceptions because of the terminology and the way it's used. The seraphim are, I think, far more fascinating and compelling divine creatures. So this is not my original argument. This has been made by other scholars, but the general line of thinking at this point in iconographic studies is that the seraphim that show up in Isaiah 6 are winged snakes. And this has to do with the etymology of the word seraphim, the masculine plural of the form saraf, to burn. And these creatures first show up in the book of Numbers, where the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness and they do Israelite things where they rebel and they get all upset about something because they want to go back to Egypt. And Yahweh sends poisonous snakes to I don't know, to kill some of the Israelites. I mean, that's what happens. And then but some of them are their name literally means to burn, which matches sort of the description in Isaiah. And the constellation of texts, not just in Numbers, but some other examples in the book of Isaiah, not just Isaiah 6 and in the book of Deuteronomy, indicate that we're dealing with a serpentine-like creature. And when we look at the iconography from Iron Age Israel, specifically the 8th and 7th centuries, we see an image that is ubiquitous, especially in Judahite iconography from the southern part of Israel. And it is a winged snake. They have 2 wings, they have 4 wings. We don't have any examples of 6-winged ones like we get in the story in Isaiah, but I think we can safely say that we're probably dealing with a winged snake of some kind. And this image comes from Egyptian religious traditions. This image is closely associated with the sun god. And it just so happens that in this period in Iron Age Israel, we see this really interesting solar interpretation of the deity too. So not only do we get this winged serpent associated with the sun god, but it appears that the god of Judah, probably Yahweh, is also imagined as a solar deity. The now relatively well-known Hezekiah seal has a winged sun disk on it, and a winged scarab. There we have all these jar seals from this period as well that have winged scarabs and winged suns. And so there's this anyway. So the seraphim, most likely winged serpents. What's really interesting too is this continues throughout sort of ancient Near Eastern lore. There's a story about Ashurbanipal when he travels to Egypt. He says he sees these things. He says he sees flying snakes in the desert on his way to Egypt. Herodotus tells us the same thing. I don't know what they're seeing, but apparently the Israelites know about winged snakes in the Sinai and in the desert, and so do Herodotus and Ashurbanipal.
And whether or not we ever get a skeleton of such a creature to prove that it exists, there are snakes with venom that burns. And so you can kind of see this association of burning venom with a snake with like generations and generations of mythology, the role that the snake played in cultures. And so it's an interesting, like putting those things all together. Maybe just in closing, we should talk about, okay, so we have images and then we have text. But what happens when we have text with image? And this is where things get a little sticky. And you do a great job in your class. And so people who want to dive into this a lot more should take your class at IBC. But we have pottery in particular that has drawings on it. There's figurines of sorts. It's a little hard for a modern, untrained eye to be looking at these ancient things and know what they represent. But we do have several pictures like that, iconography of sorts, matched with words, Yahweh and his Asherah. Mm-hmm. What do we do with that?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like people who have been trying to answer that question for, let's say, like almost the last 45 years have maintained their jobs trying to answer this question. Right. So, I mean, I think we can step back from the specific example of Kuntilladaj Rud for just a moment to talk about sort of the broader context of this text image issue in the study of iconography more generally. And this is a continual methodological question in art history. What is the relationship between a text that accompanies an image? Does it interpret the text or the image for you? Does the text add something to the image? Are they distinct, independent, or are they mutually informative? And of course, I mean, the simple answer is, well, it depends on what the context of the thing it is we're studying. And, you know, there are all sorts of fun postmodern examples where you see this attempt to sort of break down the relationship between the text and the image. And There are modern Assyriologists and art historians who are working on this very topic. Irene Winter has written a lot about this, on the relationship between the text and the image, especially in Mesopotamia, and whether the text actually helps us, or sometimes it might hinder our interpretation. So it's important to remember that, or to have that sort of background going to Kuntilat Ajrud and trying to interpret what's going on there. So the Pithoi have all of these images, and then we have these blessings, and they mention Yahweh and his Asherah. As you can imagine, as you know, when these things were published initially, the response was, we are going to take the sort of the entities that are mentioned in the inscription or in the blessings, and we're going to correspond them to the images. And lo and behold, it doesn't quite work out, because there are more figures in the images than there are mentioned in the text. And so, is Yahweh depicted twice? Is Asherah here and Asherah over there, or is Asherah nowhere? There are all these weird questions that get asked, and I think this has to do with the philological background of much of the discipline. But Kuntilat Ajrud is very interesting because, at least to my mind, we have to entertain the possibility that the inscription and the image are independent. We have an image or a series of images, like on the back of some of the Pithoi, we have depictions of a stylized tree and lions and deer, and these are often associated with the goddess in Levantine iconography. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the image is just a sort of a pictorial correlation with the text. It could just very well be someone wrote this blessing, and then someone else came along later and then drew a picture, or vice versa. And so this is kind of the tricky question with Kuntilat Ajrud. What is clear is that we have imagery that is well attested in Levantine Egyptian art in this period. The stylized tree and the lion, both are commonly associated with the goddess. We have depictions of the god Bes, who is very, very popular in this period. We have amulets from all over southern Israel depicting this god. He's very, very popular. And so the images alone, the seated figure on the throne holding the thing that might be a harp, is easily the biggest question. Who is this character? And is this Asherah? Is it not? Is it a worshiper? Who knows? But we can attest some of the imagery. So the text is very clear that we also have multiple instantiations or localized forms of Yahweh. We have Yahweh of Teman, Yahweh of the South, and Yahweh of Samaria. So we have an interesting thing going on with different variants of the God of Israel. And then we have reference to a cultic object / goddess that is well known from 1,000 years earlier. Asherah or Athirat at Ugarit, the great mother goddess of the Canaanite pantheon. And there are a lot of people who get hung up on the use of the pronominal suffix in regard to her name, because it's Yahweh and his Asherah. And there's this whole linguistic debate about, can you do this with a proper name, and all this sort of stuff. And to my mind, and I'm not the only one to think this way, but the use of the pronoun is sort of irrelevant. A cultic object and a deity are more or less the same thing, especially on a colloquial level. Maybe theologically, if we wanted to get really philosophical about this, we could say, well, there are some distinctions, but I mean, the image and the deity are virtually indistinguishable. And so the fact that Asherah is mentioned in the inscription indicates that she's a part of this cultic context, and so how we relate the image in the text is one thing, but that both indicate a very rich religious context in this period of Israel, Southern Israelite or Judahite history.
Yeah, which even in that context, the actual location of it is so far south from anything really related to the Judahite kingdom. It's almost more connected to trade routes going into Egypt. And so it is this interesting, they're so, like, whoever is there, they're so far on the margin. Mm-hmm. What does this say? Is it just this one singular group that's very, very, very far away from Jerusalem? Or again, all of these questions that we have when we find these kinds of artifacts.
Yeah, I think that, just a side note about Kuntilaraj root, or even just some of the material culture stuff that we've been talking about, especially minor art like seals or amulets. It's really hard to know how representative some of these things are for the larger population. And the same goes for the biblical literature. We just don't have the data to be able to say everyone was reading Deuteronomy and everyone thought this way. And there were some people down in the desert who were talking about Yahweh in this weird way with Asherah, and they were, bad. But we just don't have the evidence to sort of know exactly what these people are thinking. All we can say is, we have images that, transcend multiple periods of time, and, they're consistently found, or this is unique. And the same is true with texts. And to what extent that represents the broader cultural context is hard to know.
So at the end of the day, what is your favorite way to persuade people to spend time actually looking at iconography while they're reading their Bible?
I think the most valuable thing iconography provides is a visual window into the world of ancient Israel. It is so nice and liberating to be able to look into the world and sort of imagine along with the ancients when we're talking about from anything like the seraphim to the structure of the cosmos. I mean, it is just really, really enlightening. And we really get a sense of how far removed we are. It's sort of the same experience when you learn biblical Hebrew or biblical Greek for the first time and you try and interpret these texts and you realize whoa, this is way different. And the same is true when you start looking at the ways that they depict ideas like their gods or sacred space. This is a very different world. And the images really, really highlight that.
It is impossible for us to actually get inside the heads of these ancient people, but this class from Dr. Gray is like finding a small little crack in the window to try to enter into what they were thinking. Conversations like this are common here at IBC, whether in the wide variety of roundtable talks with scholars from around the world, or perhaps in our many courses. If you have not yet connected with the Israel Bible Center, consider joining our growing international group of students. From the comfort of your home and at your own pace, you can take classes and within a year earn a certificate in Jewish context and culture. Thank you, Jeremy McDonald from Mason Jar Music, for editing, mixing, and adding in all the good music. And thank you for hanging out with me and being curious about all things Bible related.